In the early years of the Australian Federation, many decisions needed to be made about how the new country should conduct itself. One such debate, as yet unsettled more than 120 years later, is of how members of Parliament should be elected. What has evolved in that time are the kinds of changes to the electoral system being debated. One of the earliest such debates was between two groups not strictly aligned by party. Bruce Graham, in a 1962 article on federal voting systems, called these groups the Proportionalists and the Dualists. The Proportionalists, among them such names as Alfred Deakin, argued that majority voting methods and excessively powerful party organisations would frustrate the will of the people and produce political disequilibrium. Only when the legislature had become a microcosm of the whole society, in all its variety of interests, could real political integration be achieved. The Dualists instead proposed that effective government could not be obtained unless the number of parties was limited to two: His Majesty's government and His Majesty's opposition. A third party, they claimed, would use the balance of power strategy to extort concessions from whichever party happened to be in power. The only jurisdiction that had begun to experiment with proportionality was Tasmania, with the Hare-Clark system that was among the first of its kind in the world. Most of the colonies used first past the post to elect MPs, which had the effect of creating dualist systems as two major groupings became the main contenders for most seats. This began with ministerialist and oppositionist groupings before official parties like the Free Trade and Protectionist parties appeared. When Labour emerged as a third political force, the three parties struggled for dominance and formed and dissolved alliances with each other, until eventually, as the system is designed to do, the Free Trade and Protectionist parties merged to form the Deaconite Liberal Party. While the Constitution contained provisions for the first election, the debate around how future elections should be conducted was controversial and ill-informed.
The division that's required! Ring the bells! Ring the bells!
The first Electoral Act, passed in 1902 by the Protectionist Labour Coalition, was initially quite ambitious. By the time it passed, it had been amended down to a legislated version of the status quo. Members of the House of Representatives continued to be elected using first past the post, and senators continued to be elected using block voting. The original bill provided for proportional representation in the Senate and optional preferential voting in the reps. The later implementation of proportional representation made it quite clear that failing to implement it in 1902 was a mistake. However, the loss of optional preferential voting, when full preferential voting was later implemented, is less disappointing. The cause of this legislative timidity was part political and part intellectual. Politically, Free traders, who had nearly taken control of the Senate in their own right at the first election, were keen to see similar performances at future elections. Moreover, there was division among protectionists about the changes, with some of the loudest voices against change coming from the government benches, backed by Melbourne's flagship protectionist newspaper, The Age, which campaigned strongly against the reforms. The intellectual side of the argument can be summarised in an exchange that occurred during the debate on the bill. Senator Sir Josiah Simon declared regarding proportional representation that 99 out of every 100 ordinary voters will never understand this system. This was followed by an interjection from Senator James Stiles, and the 100th man does not want to. The government had failed, in its opponents' eyes, to adequately explain the systems implemented by the bill. It did not help matters that the government had sought to rush through the bill at the end of a sitting period, which further agitated the opposition. It would be 10 years of political struggle as coalitions rose and fell before electoral reform came back on the agenda. Joseph Cook won the 1913 election and believed that the disparity of views within the non-Labour caucus meant that preferential voting would be a necessity to allow those competing views to contest elections against each other safely, without the risk of splitting the Conservative vote. Unfortunately for Cook, the failure of the 1902 Act to reform the Senate prohibited him from being able to reform the House of Reps, as Labour held the Senate comfortably. The block voting system of the Senate meant that whichever party garnered the most votes generally won all of a state's Senate vacancies. Unable to progress his legislative agenda, Cook took preferential voting to an election and was defeated. The outbreak of the First World War saw electoral reform left aside once again.
I warn the honourable member, the frantic speaker yells, and then the honourable member, ring the bells, ring the bells!
It is doubtless that the same concerns of split votes that had influenced Joseph Cook in seeking to implement preferential voting also influenced Billy Hughes when he introduced legislation to do so in 1918. The driving force, however, was the newly established farmers' unions, who had begun to flex their political muscles, as I have spoken about previously. When the farmers' associations began to call again for preferential voting, the nationalist government of Billy Hughes, who had changed allegiances from Labour to Nationalist during his prime ministership, gave an equivocating response. The VFU took decisive action to motivate Hughes, whose Labour origins earned him distrust in farming circles. By seeking to hold hostage the impending by-election for Flinders by running a candidate against the Nationalist candidate Stanley Bruce, he would go on to become Prime Minister in the 1920s. By doing so, the VFU threatened to split the Conservative vote, perhaps leading to a Labour victory. The Nationalists sought the withdrawal of the VFU candidate, but the VFU stood steadfast until 2 days before the by-election, when Nationalist Acting Prime Minister William Watt guaranteed the passage of preferential voting for federal elections. Having got what they wanted, the VFU threw their support behind Bruce, who was elected handily. The urgency of this matter was made clear at the Swan by-election, by which time the legislation was already before Parliament, where Labour won off of a split Conservative vote. The preferential system, once implemented, brought Conservative victory at the later Corangamite by-election. By this point, the proportional argument had been all but extinguished. Both major parties had tasted the efficiency brought by majoritarian systems, and had no interest in giving it up. Labour MP Richard West declared that, without the assistance of outside party associations, the National Parliament could not hope to solve the great problems with which we are confronted. It is for parties outside to lay down principles, and for the Parliament to give legislative effect to them. While the proportional argument was lost, the debate on preferential voting was uniquely lively, so much so that standing orders were changed so that such a debate should not occur again. On the 13th of November 1918, at 10:03 p.m, Labour Senator Albert Gardner rose to speak against the electoral bill, doing so for 12 hours and 40 minutes. Time limits for speeches were subsequently introduced. After the next election, the Nationalists held all but one of the seats in the Senate. Appropriately, the sole non-government member, styling himself as the leader of the opposition in the Senate, was Albert Gardner. An interesting consequence of preferential voting was that it led to conspicuous success for the Country Party, which benefited from the diametric opposition of the Labour and Nationalist parties. In seats where the Country Party won, Graham shows that Labour and Nationalist voters, not wishing to offer their sworn enemies a second preference, both overwhelmingly chose to give their second preference to the Country Party. This greatly boosted the Country Party's ability to win seats in a way that would not have been possible under first past the post. A similar dynamic exists in modern elections where Labour, the Liberals and the Greens receive roughly equal votes. The Greens and the Liberals' mutual dislike for each other leads to them generally giving their preferences to Labour before each other. This is not always the case, however, as the example of the Liberals' preferencing of the Greens in 2010 delivering Adam Bannett the seat of Melbourne showed.
Proportional representation really bores my blood. Right before the entrance of the usher with the blood.
It was again a matter of self-interest that brought in a fine measure in Australian democracy, that of compulsory voting. The change was made in 1924 by the Nationalists based on a perception that Labour was too good at motivating their constituents to go and vote. Compulsory voting has the effect of strengthening the mandate of elected members and of the government, as well as limiting the electoral viability of fringe ideology by not allocating electoral success based on an ability to get people to vote, but by appealing to the most people, thus pushing political debate towards the centre. Then, after almost half a century of the Senate either being a rubber stamp for the government or totally recalcitrant, the Chifley government worked towards reform to finally implement PR in the Senate. The architect of this change was Arthur Calwell, who won the caucus over by guaranteeing their re-election and that the new voting system would favour them in the future. At the first election following its enactment in 1949, Labour retained control of the Senate. At the double dissolution in 1951, however, Labour lost control of the Senate and has not regained it since. Calwell would maintain for the rest of his days his disdain for the Senate and his hope of its abolition. Subsequent years would see only a few failed referendums on electoral matters, before the Hawke government introduced two reforms that, in time, would have profound effects on the electoral system. The first was the public funding of candidates based on vote share. Today, for candidates who achieve above 4% of the vote, for each primary vote they get, they are paid just over $3, while the major parties, who attract millions of votes at elections, benefit hugely from this funding. So too do minor parties and independents who can rely on public funding in order to invest in their own campaign. The other change, a far more controversial one, was the implementation of the group voting ticket. The Hawke government suggested that, as Senate ballots continued to increase in size with more parties and candidates contesting, and the existing system requiring a voter to number every box on the Senate ballot, a system which required only one preference above the line, would decrease the rate of informal ballots. It also enabled complete party control of a voter's preference. The system would eventually be used to elect senators from very low primary votes. I cover examples of this in my previous work on Glenn Drury, the most prominent exploiter of this system. After the shocking election of the electorally unpopular Ricky Muir in 2013, the Coalition, Greens and Nick Xenophon worked to abolish group voting tickets. Like most changes of the past, the parties involved were motivated primarily by their own electoral interests. Hence Labour, who dealt and still deals with Drury, strongly opposed the change. It wasn't enough, however, and the group voting ticket was abolished in 2016.
passions without notice, a burning in my soul. A double dissolution leaves no time for rock and roll.
Often the long-term result of electoral reform is not in accordance with the short-term political goals of the government that implements them. Preferential voting was originally implemented to allow country and nationalist members to compete in seats safely. Today, the Liberal and National parties rarely contest the same seat, and instead the Labor Party is able to safely run in seats with a high Greens vote and benefit from the strong preference flow that they receive. Of course, the Greens sometimes use preferential voting to beat Labor, and Labor also only receives around 85% of Greens' preferences, with that leakage occasionally causing defeat in tight races. Moreover, whereas under a majoritarian system like first past the post, an independent would need to attract a burdensomely high primary vote in order to beat the incumbent member, preferential voting allows an independent to slightly drain an incumbent's primary, then leapfrog the other parties to victory. In the Teal seats at the 2022 election, their victories were largely founded on the primary votes of Labor and Greens voters, who either voted for them or offered them their preferences before the Liberals, and only took a small amount of their primary vote off of the incumbent to win. In a proportional system, this would be even easier, as the quota of votes required is less than the 50% plus one necessary for a single member electorate. As I mentioned before, the coalition sees no real benefit from preferential voting anymore. The LNP in Queensland at a state level have declared their intention to return to optional preferential voting, which the state had until 2015. Their thinking is that, since the Labor vote relies on Greens' preferences in many seats, making preferencing optional and allowing a single one vote to be considered formal would result in a lower flow of preferences to Labor. I would caution the LNP that they also benefit from preferences, and are more reliant in percentage terms on preferences than the ALP. It is generally accepted that the Greens are more disciplined in their preferencing of Labor than right-wing minor parties are. The Greens usually get 85% of their votes to Labor, while right-wing minor parties' flow to the coalition can sometimes get as low as 65%. The Queensland election of 2015 saw a large Just Vote One campaign run by the right-wing minor parties, which contributed to the coalition losing enough seats for Labor to govern in minority. Had the preference flow to the coalition been stronger in key seats, they would likely have formed minority government with members of the Katters Australian Party. It is notable in the LNP's defence that the Green primary, especially in Brisbane, has been growing, meaning that their benefit in numbers of votes rather than a percentage of preferences received may justify their advocacy for optional preferential voting. The keystone of the argument of two-party system advocates is that it provides stability. An MP's job, however, is not the same as that of a girder. Their job is not to provide stability, but to provide a voice for their electorate. Obviously, as no two people share identical views, and we cannot fit tens of millions into the parliament, there can never be 100% representative democracy. The issue with the current system is that the major parties have only been offering the electorate two choices of ideology. For many years, in a time where your religion, your class, or the country you or your ancestors came to Australia from determined your political persuasion, this was acceptable. Now, however, Australia's political culture demands a greater diversity of views. This is reflected in the downward trend of the major party vote, as voters use their primary vote to show support for minor parties and independents who better reflect their beliefs. This is due to a combination of factors. Many more minor parties and independents are running now than compared to past elections. The major parties have perhaps grown complacent in the 100 years since the mechanisms for their entrenchment were introduced. They have begun grappling to reconfigure themselves and their messaging into a form they believe appeals to previously untapped constituencies. Peter Dutton declared earlier this year that the Liberal Party was the party of the worker, and that big business was no longer their natural ally. Simultaneously, the Labor Party frequently spooks the endorsements of its policies that it receives from entities like the Business Council of Australia. Among traditional voters for these parties, this has been a cause for bemusement and irritation. The Electrical Trades Union has declared that they will suspend donations to Labor as a result of their dogged determination to place the CFMEU under administration. More and more Labor seats are becoming vulnerable to the Greens as Labor's middle-way policy bleeds votes to the left. So what is the answer? A two-party system brings stability at the cost of generalising the views of the electorate, while a proportional system is more representative but risks legislative and executive instability. The solution is somewhere between these 2 points. A system which does not discount the still considerate support the major parties attract, while still allowing minority voices an opportunity to get elected. One example would be combining the current single-member electorates into multi-member ones, perhaps returning 3 to 5 members each. Given the state of the primary votes of the major parties, any such change, even a conservative one, would likely make winning an election majority a difficult task. The government, still formed by one of the major parties, would then need to negotiate with the crossbench to pass legislation. In some situations, the government may find itself in a fairly benign minority situation, as exists in New South Wales currently, where the Labor government can find the votes it needs for progressive legislation with the Greens, and for centrist or conservative legislation with the former members of the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers, who are now independents. Even without any reform, frequent minority governments may become a feature of Australian democracy. Labor won the 2022 election with the smallest majority of an incoming government in living memory. Electoral fortunes rarely improve when seeking a second term in government, and if the major party vote continues to trend downwards, it may not return to a level capable of delivering majority government for some time. Hence, instead of considering their policy and messaging strategies to better appeal to the electorate, the current government is looking at ways of removing minor parties and independents. There is certainly no chance of a major party government willingly implementing a proportional system for the House of Reps, but a future minority government situation may twist the government's arm into further empowering the crossbench. Whether this will be seen, however, is up to those crossbenchers. The common thread in all major reform, from preferential voting to compulsory voting, to proportional representation, to the abolition of the group voting ticket, is that change is almost always brought to foster political advantage, but often has unintended consequences.
Give it all up, all blood and single, vote with your feet.